Did you kill your daughter?
No, that's an emphatic no. I mean, the ludicrous thing is what's been purported from Portugal is that Madeleine died in the apartment by an accident and we hid her body. Well, when did she have the accident and died? Because the only time she was left unattended was when we were at dinner. So if she died then, how could we have disposed or hidden her body, when there was an immediate threat? It's just nonsense. So, and if she died when we were in the apartment or fell and did something, why would we cover that up?
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. In the first part in this two-part episode dealing with episode 4 of the Netflix series, which I've titled Barking Equals Backlash ? We have Jerry responding to this issue of, well, is Madeleine still alive? And he's sort of not just dismissive, but he has absolute contempt for the idea, and in expressing his contempt, he raises some very important questions. One of them is, when did she have the accident and died? And then he sort of refers to the only time that Madeleine was left unattended was when they were at dinner. So there is already sort of trying to almost suggest that's likely when she could have or would have died, is when they weren't there, right? But one can also look at it in a different way and say, well, she was actually left maybe unattended quite a lot. Maybe she was left unattended, when he was playing tennis or whatever the case. But the point is, that's quite an important question, is when was Madeleine left unattended? And we know that every single day that the children were taken to creches and dropped off, right? It's also a time where the family's on holiday, there's football on television, all that kind of thing. But I think Jerry's right in the sense that I don't think Madeleine died when her parents were out eating dinner. And then the second aspect that Jerry raises, he says, if Madeleine fell and died when they were in the apartment, he's saying, why would they do that? Like, why would they cover something up that was an accident? And that's an excellent point. If it was an accident, then there would be absolutely no reason to cover something up. And this is something that I notice happens quite often. In the John Benet Ramsey case, you have it. In fact, it's the version of the CBS documentary. In the Casey Anthony case, you have the same thing, that Kaylee died in a drowning accident. And yeah, in the McCann case as well. You have people who seriously think that you would go to all this effort to cover up an accident. Nobody covers up accidents. There's absolutely no reason to cover up accidents. So what happened here wasn't an accident. I'm not saying there wasn't an accidental or random element to it. I'm just saying there's absolutely no reason to cover up an accident, because an accident is innocent. It's when something isn't innocent that it needs to be covered up. What's also very interesting, when Jerry responds to this idea, he talks about two things. He talks about when and how. And I think it's important to address those questions. But the pertinent question that he's not asking, of course, is where. So obviously when is important, and that's kind of an interesting aspect with the Netflix documentary. If you want to do a proper true crime investigation, you go through the narrative chronologically from the one end to the other end. You don't kind of selectively go forwards and backwards and jump in here and jump out there. You go through the narrative in the order that it happened. And you don't really see that happening, and that's what this episode's all about. We're looking at what isn't addressed by episode 4. And then the other thing that Jerry asks is how. He says, how could we have done it? And I think what he's getting at there is sort of saying, the Tupper 7 sort of say where they were. The Tupper 7 sort of said that, Jerry and Kate were kind of at the restaurant the whole time, and also that when Jerry wasn't at the restaurant, then he was talking to not one but 2 other people in the street. So they kind of accounted for the whole time. And then there's that short little window where Kate leaves and she's the only one, and she walks to the apartment and then she runs back, so she couldn't have done anything, right? The interesting thing with this version of events is when they confronted by that German reporter, you kind of have the opposite situation where they sort of asked, people are becoming suspicious or whatever, and then they say, well, we were constantly checking on the children. But if you're constantly checking on the children, then you wouldn't have an alibi because you wouldn't be sitting at the restaurant. So it's kind of played both ways. It's kind of played the way of, well, they were constantly checking, so they there's no issue of neglect or not failing in their duties as parents. But then when it's about their alibi, then, well, they were accounted for the whole time. But if you accounted for the whole time, how could you have been checking? Oh, no, someone else was checking. Oh, okay, so you weren't checking on your own children, someone else was checking, and that then also answers the question that, there was a complete, we're good and caring parents, and we just had somebody else check on our behalf. Okay, well, that's certainly one way of playing it. But this whole question that was asked, did Madeline die in the apartment, comes up as a result of exactly this. The dogs barking, the dogs alerting, and it raises all sorts of uncomfortable questions. What we're going to deal with in this episode as well is what I call the golden rings running hare's hinge or juncture. It's the moment where a narrative kind of is heading in a certain direction and then it just goes somewhere completely different. The Golden Rings Running Hares is based on that well-known Christmas carol, The 12 Days of Christmas. And interestingly, when you get to on the 5th day of Christmas, you kind of have great disparity between the lyrics. In some versions of the song, they're golden rings, and in others, they're running hares. It's just they're completely different, whereas in some of the other lyrics, there's just a little bit of variation. So you might have collie birds, which is another word for blackbirds, or calling birds. That's very similar. And there are a couple of other similarities as well. But as soon as you go from golden rings to running hares, you've got a very strong departure. And in the Ramsey case, that strong departure kind of happens where you kind of make the decision and you say, well, we're going to take this ransom note seriously. We're going to assume that the ransom note's not written by Patsy Ramsey, even though there's a lot of consensus that it was, and that it kind of resembled her handwriting, and that the note was found inside the home, and the pen was also found inside the home, etc. Now, instead, we're going to say an intruder wrote the note, or that the note points to an intruder, and that's how you turn golden rings into running hares, because then suddenly it departs down the intruder narrative, and the hares then multiply into more and more and more possibilities, right? Now, in this episode, we're going to look at how the same thing happened in the McCann case. So in the same way that you can look at the ransom note and say, well, that's going to determine whether Ramsey case goes forward or doesn't. And so, yeah, in the McCann case, we're going to look at the equivalent. And how we do that is we're going to just sort of go through around about 6 aspects that the docuseries left out of episode 4. You can kind of nitpick and say, well, they're under no expectation to tick off every single box, but these are kind of pretty big boxes. You would have kind of expected them to mention these significant milestones at this point. It's episode 4 already, and we're just going to sort of question why it's not mentioned. Before we get to that, if you're enjoying this channel, if you're enjoying the coverage, there are another 5 episodes left in this series on TCRS debunks. So if you'd like to catch them, subscribe to the channel, ring the bell for notifications, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So of the 6 elements that I feel are missing from episode 4, the one that I've highlighted first, and I think it is the most important one, the most important aspect missing, it's Dani Krichel. He was the South African dude whose idea it was to do a cadaver search. And I can cover Dani Krichel in more detail if you guys want me to. But you kind of had an interesting situation here. You kind of had a pair of well-to-do doctors, intelligent people, and they then elected to make use of Krichel's services, and his services were explicitly in locating people or locating dead bodies. And so I think it was in June or July. I think it was actually July, mid-July. I say that under correction, but it was one of those months. Krichel arrived in Praia de Luge and he set about looking for Madeleine. And the strange thing was the McCanns didn't really associate with him. You didn't see them together, even though they'd hired him. You didn't kind of see the McCanns sort of, they've hired this guy to find their daughter, and they're not even sort of searching with them. What are the McCanns doing? They're kind of traveling all over Europe. And later on, Jerry even went to America. And they weren't really searching for Madeleine on those trips. It wasn't like they would land at the airport and then kind of sort of go somewhere and call out Madeleine's name and look for her in a crowd. They would sort of arrive somewhere and attend a press conference and speak to the media. That's kind of how the McCanns looked, in inverted commas, for Madeleine. So, yeah, you've got this guy, Krichel, and he's hired to come to Praia de Luge and look for Madeleine, and he's hired by the McCanns. And yet the McCanns, as much as they've hired him, they're not really sort of supporting him, or they don't seem to be particularly interested in what he's doing. But they do get he does get the sort of attention of the local police. The local police are sort of wondering what's going on here. Who's this dude? What is going on? And they kind of have to monitor him. And in a way, the police are distracted because they've sort of got to keep tabs on Krichel and, see what he finds out. You could have a situation where they've told Krichel where their child is, and you could have some kind of nefarious situation where Krichel is now going to be doing something, or maybe even tampering with something. I'm just saying the police have got to be cautious about that, and so they've got to. And so Krichel's arrival on the scene is kind of going to pull the police investigation kind of away from their work. Instead of them looking for Madeleine or following leads, they're going to kind of have to babysit Crichel. And one kind of gets the idea there was maybe a bit of hostility, a bit of unfriendliness. Like, who's this guy intruding on their turf? It's their jurisdiction, it's their job, right? And one could also say, maybe Crichel felt a bit done in by the fact that the McCanns weren't sort of, sending in the welcome wagon for him, and he could have gotten a lot of exposure if they had sort of given him a pat on the back and sort of, held a press conference and said, "This is Darnie. Can you extend him every courtesy or something?" And maybe he felt a little bit done in by that. All of this is speculation, of course. The bottom line is, when Crichel left empty-handed, he hadn't found Madeleine. But what he did do, kind of as an afterthought, is he just sort of told the cops that they should do a cadaver search. Now, I don't have a problem with the Portuguese police. I think they were, adequate in what they were doing. But in this area, they certainly did kind of take a feather out of someone else's cap, just in the sense that Crichel kind of said to them, "Guys, you need to be looking for a dead person," right? And he also told them how. He said, "You need to get cadaver dogs," and I'm not sure whether he gave them the details of Grimes and so on, but it was as a result of Crichel's arrival and departure that the Portuguese investigation kind of changed. So if they resented him being there, they certainly were influenced by him in a direct way, and arguably in a way that totally shook up the entire investigation, and arguably created the breakthrough in the investigation. So although Crichel's been kind of maligned, for having like a tricorder device, that this kind of magical device, he did offer probably the most practical, cogent, helpful advice in the entire case of anybody. And that's not mentioned at all in this episode. There's no mention of Crichel here in episode 4. There's no mention of how he how the cadaver dog search was kind of as a result of his, not intervention, but I guess suggestion, right? Since this was such a major moment, it's just odd that you wouldn't mention him. Does Crichel reflect very well on the McCanns? That's a separate question. Another aspect that is also missing here, and again, it's irrespective of whether it comes up later in the documentary, the point is, when you're talking about the cadaver dog search and the aftermath, this is essentially what happened right at the end of July, and then August, and then they were made suspects in September. So why would you not talk about things that happened prior to the cadaver dog search? And so one of the things that happened was that Jerry McCann went to America. And again, did Jerry McCann really think that Madeleine was in America? Was there any clue? Was there any hint, any footprint, or any sort of suggestion that Madeleine was in America? Why did Jerry go to America? And again, it's not Jerry looking for Madeleine in the White House, or Jerry looking for Madeleine in the streets of Washington. It's him giving press conferences and appearing on television. And you've also got to ask yourself, for somebody who is, has lost a child, the child has disappeared, there's a sort of ridiculous amount of time spent giving interviews and press conferences, and a ridiculous amount of time not actually searching for someone. And the McCann sort of motto for the last 12 years has been that everyone must keep looking for Madeleine except them. Everyone must not give up hope, except they seem to kind of not be looking for her themselves. I mean, when last did they go back to Portugal? Where else are you going to look for Madeleine except in Portugal? And why are you going to America as early as July when, 2 months after her disappearance, has Madeleine gone global? And if you think about the irony of, they're in all these countries, Spain, Germany, Italy, America, and then you sort of say, wow, the cadaver alerts were found in apartment 5A, not in the White House, not in the Vatican, not in Westminster, not in Rothley. It was right where the McCanns were staying. And so you've got to ask yourself, why were the McCanns going everywhere else except, start in the obvious place, right? And what was interesting about Jerry's trip to America, there was some kind of controversy around it, which included, how he got, I think it was first class air tickets, and people didn't really like that. I can't remember whether it was said that he was gifted the tickets by Richard Branson or something, or whether he bought them with fundraising money. All I remember was there was a little bit of a stink around it. He also took along the family campaign manager, Justine McGuinness, and they were going to just, go to America and talk about child abduction with experts. And then have meetings scheduled with U.S. senators, congressmen, and senior members of Laura Bush's staff, the First Lady at the time. And at the same time that this was happening, Kate McCann was in Portugal with the two children, the other two children. Again, if your one child's been abducted, should you really be leaving the rest of your family and just sort of going, somewhere else? In any event, at the time, posters of Madeleine were being displayed at booksellers in more than 200 countries around the world. So, it's quite important to sort of walk into a bookstore, maybe in Australia or in South Africa or in Argentina, and then maybe look down the street, maybe you might see Madeleine there. And this was in July. Or maybe you would want to go and check apartment 5A for evidence. And this brings us to point number 3, which I think is very underappreciated even by people who are very anti the McCanns and even very sort of suspicious of them. You don't really hear about this very much, and that is that none of Madeleine's DNA was ever found in Portugal, officially. So you kind of have the situation where the police are now thinking and in these lines of, we need to find out if this is Madeleine's DNA. We want to find out whether that is Madeleine's DNA. We want to look for traces of Madeleine. We're now no longer looking necessarily for Madeleine, a living child. We're looking for traces. We want to test traces. We want to go into the apartment, take samples, and test those samples, right? That's the kind of angle that they were taking. And then they found a very odd kind of result. And it was, and this is from the police's perspective, it was that, wow, none of Madeleine's DNA is in Portugal. And just think about that. Think about someone living in a hotel room and you're not able to sort of find any DNA of a particular person, and then you've sort of got to say, wow, was all of their clothing washed? Were even their shoes washed that there's no evidence? And then also, was their bedding washed as well? To the extent that absolutely no DNA is now recoverable in Portugal. Even her pillow on her bed in her room, is there no DNA on there? No, there's not. That in itself is pretty incredible, that you would have someone living for 5-6 days in apartment 5A and fail to leave any trace of themselves. Did Madeleine not drink or eat anything in the kitchen? Did she not use the bathroom and have a towel? Anything like that? And also a cuddle cat. Did she not leave DNA on her favorite toy? And amazingly enough, the investigators weren't able to get Madeleine's DNA anywhere. And so you had this really strange thing where to find Madeleine's DNA, it had to be sourced remotely from a pillow in Rothley. So the impression I kind of get is that in order for the investigators to get Madeleine's DNA, someone else, kind of an interloper, an agent, had to provide them with a sample. So it's someone giving them a sample from a remote location where the police aren't sort of there when the sample is recovered. This sample is recovered, I think it was from her pillow, from hairs on a hairbrush or something like that, supposedly in Rothley. So the police aren't actually there when the sample is recovered. But this sample is now said to be Madeleine's, right? I think that's a very important point to make. Now, bear in mind, this episode is about how do you turn golden rings into running hairs? How do you turn something that is specifically one way, one version, into something completely different? Well, this is the beginnings of how you could do that. And by the way, in the Ramsey case, you have kind of something similar. You had a lot of evidence, and then at some point, after the Ramseys were found to, after the Ramseys were indicted on child abuse resulting in death and an accessory, some DNA evidence sort of came up that proved that none of the Ramseys' DNA was on John Benet's body. And so suddenly the whole thing kind of changed, and now it became, so it had to have been an intruder, and so the Ramseys are off the hook, and so golden rings became running hairs, and the hairs have since multiplied, becoming, could it be this intruder, could it be that pedophile, could it be this kidnapper or that one, right? So that's how it happened in the Ramsey case. And this brings us to point number 4. The docuseries makes no mention that the British lab which did the DNA testing was later closed down. It's called the FFS lab. It's more than a little tricksy for the docuseries to interrogate the trustworthiness and prognosticate on the processes of the Portuguese police, and of course also kind of laugh at the efficacy of the dogs, but not do the same due diligence on a dodgy British lab which handled a critical aspect of the McCann case and was subsequently shut down. Now, this point kind of raised the ire of someone who previously worked at that lab. I'm going to get to that in due course. And this person basically took me to task for saying that this lab was dodgy and that its DNA testing was tricksy. And that's something I'm going to address here as well. Remember, what you're trying to do is answer the question of, how do you turn 5 golden rings into 5 running hares, right? So if you go to a BBC article dated 21 February 2007, and this date is literally 3 months prior to, less than 3 months prior to Madeline's, the incident surrounding Madeline. And what this is about police reviewing criminal DNA cases in Britain. So it's literally a couple of months before Madeline's, whatever happened to her. I don't want to call it a disappearance. And the police are reviewing criminal DNA from this it's not FFS, it's FSS lab, the Forensic Science Service. And what you get from this particular article is pretty incredible. It refers to the quality of evidence that they were examining, the quality of feedback that they were giving, and it also refers to cases where people were being wrongly convicted. Or you could have a situation where you had a no result in DNA tests, which would have meant that potentially a guilty person was not convicted. And it then refers to a review of a lot of cases where the FSS analyzed tiny samples of blood or saliva for a DNA profile only to get a negative result. So in other words, they'd be given a sample and then just not get any kind of profile. That kind of their testing would show insufficient sample size to create a profile. And detectives would be kind of mystified by this. They sort of say, well, why is there should be a profile given what we gave you. And what was happening was the FSS were kind of using old technology and applying a low copy number technique, but in a defective way, in a kind of a different way. And this caused them to miss DNA evidence that other private labs would have identified. So you've literally got a situation where when you give your sample to FSS, they get a negative result when there is a sample, when there is a viable sample, when there should be a profile. Whereas if you give it to another private forensic lab, then they do get a sample. And so if you want your sample to disappear, then send it to FSS. And so what's crazy about this guy who took issue with what I was saying, he was saying, no, the FSS is like a world-class lab and blah, blah, blah. Well, no, it wasn't. Not in 2007. I'll return to that in a second. As soon as you start talking about that stuff, it kind of sometimes feels like gobbledygook. You're not sure what you're talking about. And that's why it's important just to simplify and clarify. And the simple version is when Madeline's DNA was sent to the FSS, they kind of just said, this isn't Madeline's DNA, or we can't say that this is Madeline's DNA. And then Madeline's DNA disappears, and that means Madeline is still alive. That is how hocus pocusy that whole narrative was. So you kind of had the dogs finding traces of Madeline in the apartment. Those traces are then sent to FSS, and then FSS conjures that evidence into nothing and says, oh, no, this is nothing, or it is it's somebody else. This is one of the twins. And as I say, you've got to look at where did the sample come from, and did the Portuguese police recover that sample themselves, right? And that, as I say, is how you turn 5 golden rings into 5 running hares. Point number 5, Madeline's paternity was called into question following the release of DNA results. And this caused great controversy. You kind of had 2 separate sets of reporting. You kind of had one narrative in Portugal and one narrative in in Britain, you kind of had the Portuguese talking about paternity, and you had the British talking about how filthy and opportunistic and deceitful the Portuguese tabloids were. And this coming from the British tabloids is kind of a joke. Right now, the British tabloids are kind of under scrutiny in terms of the royal family. The British tabloids are famous for being amongst the worst in the world. And so for the British tabloids to criticize anybody else is a joke. For the British tabloids to criticize anyone else in terms of, oh, I don't know whether you're being accurate or something like that, is an absolute joke. The British tabloids aren't the most reliable. It's not the most reliable journalism in the world, and it certainly is. It follows the cash cow, basically. The tabloids sell what makes them money, and that's what makes them so poisonous and biased, especially in this particular case. And so when Madeline's paternity came up, and of course this puts things in a very different perspective. If Madeline isn't the daughter of one or both of the parents, you can certainly see a situation for possible difficulties between the parents and the child. And what I mean is, if you have a child that's not yours, and this is a very difficult child, you might have difficulties in that situation. You might feel, I'm not going to take it any further than that, but it's something that can definitely go to motive. Would you care more about your own child or someone else's child? And you can conflate it with stepchildren and so on in mixed families. How the stepchildren treated. Sometimes they're not treated as well as they should. There's sometimes jealousy, there's sometimes resentment, and so on. I'm not going to take it further than that, except to say the publication that printed this allegation were sued, weren't they? I mean, what a heretical thing to say. And couldn't the FSS theoretically be cited as a contradictory scientific source, proving the allegations of paternity were unfounded? I mean, couldn't you sort of go to the FSS and say, can you prove that this isn't the case? Of course, none of this was touched upon or even hinted at in episode 4 of the Netflix documentary. Obviously, where there is a contention that Madeline's paternity might be in any doubt, as I say, this could potentially go to motive and could possibly explain, at the very least, conflicting emotions and responses and a range of psychologies and dynamics to a particular child that is not the biological offspring of one of the parents, and who might also be, as I say, difficult to raise or troublesome putting to sleep. And we know that one thing that I think was different between Madeline and the other children was she was conceived through IVF. And so if you are talking about this possibility of paternity, well, at any time when you're having IVF, you can have a situation either where samples are mixed up, or you can say it's not a conventional situation of procreating, of falling pregnant. And so this is what the sort of article in 24 Horace was sort of getting at. And what was interesting was it was basically identifying Jerry as not the biological parent of Madeline. So they're saying Kate is the biological parent, but Jerry isn't. And Jerry then rejected this claim. He said that it wasn't some other sperm donor used for the IVF. He said, I am Madeline's dad, and this was in the Evening Standard. And the Evening Standard then quoted the 24 Horace article, just saying her DNA could not be confused with that of 2-year-old twins, Sean and Emily. Sorry, that is what 24 Horror said, was that there was such a big difference between the DNA that it couldn't be confused with that of the twins. And bear in mind, this is what the McCanns kind of said early on. When they found DNA traces in the rental, in kind of like a oily substance that they said was fish blood or something from groceries, they said, and then they later on said, well, it could also be DNA from the other children. And according to 24 Horace, that wasn't a possibility. You couldn't mistake the DNA for that of the siblings. And this led to a really fascinating response by Eileen McCann from Glasgow, Madeline's grandmother. And what Eileen said was, to say Jerry's not Madeline's natural father is utterly ridiculous. She said, Madeline is my natural granddaughter. Her eyes and nose are the same as mine. She says these allegations are totally unfounded, pure speculation, and a load of nonsense. And I think she's right. I think Eileen is Madeline's natural grandmother, and maybe her eyes and nose are the same, but that could still open up other possibilities. The fact is that Kate McCann said that she struggled to conceive for quite a long time, and how did she then ultimately conceive? Well, we know it was through IVF, but after many years of struggle, did they not try different alternatives? And so what's really interesting in this article is it sort of refers to a series of articles in 24 Horace saying that its co-editor, Louis Fontes, insisted that he was standing by the sperm donor story. It wasn't the journalist talking about this, it's the editor. And he was saying that this was actually confirmed by the Forensic Science Service in Birmingham. And then FSS denied that it made any comment on the case. And what's really strange is, in a case that has so much litigation and so many lawsuits for defamation, you have this very, very painful allegation if it's not true, and then nothing happened. Mr. Fontes said he was not aware of any threat of legal action from the McCanns over the article, and he said it's absolutely true, our sources are rock solid. And then he said, if they think they can sue us, bring it on. Those are kind of fighting words for an editor. You kind of get the sense that whatever he thinks he knows, right? In any event, the McCanns denied all of this, and in October 2007, the Telegraph published a story saying that the McCanns deny reports that Jerry is not Madeline's father. So that was certainly part of the narrative. Oh, it looks like I've made an error here. It looks like all three of the children were conceived by in vitro fertilization. I kind of get the idea that Madeline was just quite hard to conceive. There was, the first child was quite a struggle, and then the other children wasn't so much of a struggle. In any event, apologies for the error there. So all three children were in vitro fertilization. You can sort of see how twins being born can be also kind of an unexpected situation where you have in vitro fertilization that leads not just to one viable fetus but two, right? That does sometimes happen. Another aspect to that is, if the McCanns were struggling financially or just starting their family and they maybe wanted a second child, the fact that they had twins, I think, could have put additional pressure on them at kind of a vulnerable time for them. You're not just having a second child born early on, you're having a third child added as well. In the same article, it refers to the tabloid 24 Horace claiming that British police visited a sperm bank the couple used and tracked down the 4-year-old's natural father to rule him out of any involvement in her abduction. And this is pretty incredible. It's a claim, of course, but it's saying that British police visited a sperm bank, not Portuguese police, and this is the claim, the British police tracked down the natural father through the sperm bank to rule him out, to rule him out of the abduction. Because think about it like this. You're trying to identify who would abduct Madeleine, and you're saying, well, what about the natural father? So that certainly kind of makes sense in a way, that maybe, her father wanted custody of her and abducted her, kind of thing. And then Clarence Mitchell described the reports as unwarranted, unsubstantiated, and totally inaccurate. He said the couple planned to sue 24 Horace over the allegations as soon as their official suspect status was lifted. But it appears the McCanns didn't sue 24 Horace. And then point number 6, the last photo controversy is not highlighted in episode 4. And that's, I think that's being a little bit nitpicky, because, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to be brought up in this episode. It is kind of talking about Madeleine being deceased. So wouldn't it make sense to sort of, in that respect, talk about the last time she was seen, or the last photo that was taken of her? In any event, it does make a few appearances. This last photo of Madeleine does make a few appearances in episode 4, including inside the church in Praia de Luz. And in that image that's in the church, the tip of Jerry's left elbow is strangely missing from the image. And I've done a study of the image, which I posted on Shakedown. You can read that on what to make of the last photo of Madeleine McCann. I know a little bit of what I'm talking about because I'm a photographer myself. As in, I've done magazine journalism photography, and I do a lot of editing of photos. And so, there are quite a few aspects one wants to look at in the last photo. The lighting, just the way the background sort of integrates or doesn't quite integrate. And so I think you can rely on just a little bit of expertise just from someone who knows photography in terms of the last photo. And then to wrap up, there are many more insights and omissions to highlight from episode 4. But for me, one of the aspects that stood out the most were the PR people skulking around in the background, and they feature so prominently as important narrators in the docuseries. You literally have the McCann's own PR people telling their story. And are you telling me that their PR people aren't going to tell a positive story or put a positive spin on everything? And that was one of the biggest clues that sort of gave away the fact that this docuseries wasn't going to be neutral or fair or factual, completely factual, but was instead going to be kind of sentimental and supportive and sympathetic, and basically apologia, McCann apologia. And that's why it's so laughable how the episode 4 starts off, where it kicks off with, when you're talking about the dogs barking, well, that's a backlash. So stupid. Anyway, and then it says, in one particular photo, you sort of see this PR dude walking, kind of skulking behind the McCanns and talking about how he counted well over 70 photographers. And I love the way these guys sort of almost like are surprised by all of this. You know, they sort of talk about the media as if they've got nothing to do with it, when they're the ones choreographing the whole dance, they're the one organizing the whole thing, and then when they come into this docuseries, it's sort of like got nothing to do with them, when that's their job. Their job is public relations. Their job is contacting the media and getting the stories out there. They kind of have this funny disconnection where now that it's 12 years later, they seem to just have kind of an amnesia where they seem to forget what they were doing. You were there to make the McCanns look innocent. That's what your job was. Your job was to put out a narrative sympathetic to the McCanns. People who were seen to be possible suspects, your job was to try and make them look innocent. And you try to get as much media on your side as you could. And yet, when you see them on the other side of time, they can't understand why there's so much media, and they're harassed by the media, and the media is this and the media is that. It's just a strange forgetfulness that one sees. And you see this forgetfulness particularly with Justine McGuinness, who she's sort of chaperoning the McCanns and doing her thing, and then as soon as the McCanns are suspects, then suddenly she will literally put her hand on the microphone of reporters, literally putting her hand on, actually physically on the microphone and pushing it away. And so if you just think about the, as far as I'm concerned, the hypocrisy where when the media are positive and sympathetic to the McCanns, then it's one big party in a way. It's sort of let's talk about this and smile, and it's wonderful having all the media here, whatever. As soon as it's the tide is changed, then you literally push away microphones and make it difficult for the media. And so the answer to how do you turn 5 golden rings into 5 running hares is quite simple, although not necessarily that easy to bring about. First of all, you need a lot of public relations, so you need a lot of people to push out this advertisement that you're trying to sell. Right? So that's the one aspect. And then the other aspect is you need to kind of conjure a magic trick. You need to use some evidence aspect. DNA is a great example. And then what you do is you sort of conjure that into a story. So you could say, and it happened in the Amanda Knox case, you can say, because there's not an absolute proof that this DNA belongs to someone, that then means there's no evidence, right? And those are the words Jerry McCann uses repeatedly. He will say, there's no evidence that something happened to Madeleine McCann, but the reality is there was evidence, it just wasn't 100%, or even if it was 100%, the FSS labs dropped the ball in that department. But the point is, because the evidence isn't 100%, it now becomes cast as no evidence, and then that's how 5 golden rings become 5 running hares. Does that make sense? Okay, so in the next episode, which is episode 5 in the Netflix documentary series, we deal with kind of the fight back, the kind of slow process where the McCanns come back from this backlash in inverted commas, and it's kind of predictable. What happens is they sort of talk up the popularity contest aspect to it, which is they try to convince everyone how many people believe them and how a tiny minority of people doubt their version of events. And so it's kind of the popularity contest version, which is what PR is all about. PR tries to make it seem not necessarily popular, but it's broadcast widely, and so that's enough for it to become the new truth, the post-truth. So if you're interested in following that analysis in this ongoing series of TCRS debunks, please subscribe to the channel. On Patreon, I have a couple of chapters in the audiobook Christmas Star. I think I've already got 5 chapters up. I'm putting up 1 chapter a day, and so in about a week or so, the entire audiobook will be available, read by me. And then also on Patreon, there's some interesting content on the ransom note, Burke and John Ramsey's responses to the ransom note. What did they think about it? It's really fascinating, and that's on Patreon. And then coming soon on Patreon is probably available on Monday, is TCRS versus Dr. Werner Spitz, and that's really looking at Werner Spitz's forensic report on what he believes happened, the logical sequence of events on the night John Bonet was killed. And I'm going to look at what I agree with there and what I don't. So go and check out Patreon. It's Patreon/TCRS. Thank you for listening.